So it's just a ton of fun, as you can see, to get a chance to see where everybody is tuning in from the world. We gratefully appreciate all of you joining us today, as Dominic said, especially from those coming from vastly different time zones. So we gather together today from all parts of the globe to join our panel for a conversation about noetic wisdom in aging. And we'll hear from our three special guests from A Tribe Called Aging, Marc Blesoff, Evelina Everidge, and Elizabeth White, each of whom have a deep commitment to exploring what it means to age consciously. So before we do that, Dominic has a few technical pieces that he'd like to dive into and then throw it back to me. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you, Kirsten. Yes, we'd like to go first over a few of the Zoom controls before we get started on today's webinar. So what you're seeing here on the screen is your control panel for the webinar, and you have a chance to ask the panelists a question later on, and you can write your question into the Q&A box at any time. Please don't put your questions into the chat box because they may get lost among all the comments. So to access your Zoom menu bar, you may need to wave your mouse over your Zoom screen to have the menu bar pop up, and if you're on a smartphone device, simply tap on your screen and the menu bar should pop up. When you click on the Q&A button here, a window will pop up prompting you to pose a question. And I did want to mention something about the chat feature also when you're commenting during the webinar. So for the chat function, you can either chat to just the panelists or all panelists and attendees. And by default, it only shows to panelists. So if you click here in the to field, you can update it to chat to everybody on the call today. So thank you so much. And I am now pleased to turn this back over to Kirsten.
Great, thank you, Dominic. So, noetic wisdom in aging. The word noetic comes from the Greek noesis or noetikos, meaning inner wisdom, direct knowing, intuition, implicit understanding. The philosopher William James says that noetic refers to states of insight into depths of truth unplumbed by the discursive intellect. So according to James, these states of insight are illuminations, revelations, full of significance and importance. The Institute of Noetic Sciences was founded by Apollo 14 astronaut Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, after he had a spontaneous and profound noetic experience. On his way back to Earth, gazing out the window of his space capsule, Dr. Mitchell was nearly overwhelmed with a profound sense of being interconnected to everything: the Earth, humanity, the stars, cosmos. He described his experience as a deep intrinsic knowing, a noetic knowing, a sense of interconnection that could not be known by the intellect alone. And as the past few months have made glaringly clear, humanity is facing significant challenges. And many older people are experiencing a reality that looks very different from what we might have expected at this time in our lives. So now more than ever, we need to engage in expanded ways of thinking and seeing and experiencing the world. So today we gather to hear from three exceptional people who will share with us some of their insights into how the noetic can inform a process of aging consciously. So we're going to start with 2 rounds of questions, followed by an experiential attunement. And then we'll have time for your questions as well. So as Dominic mentioned, please feel free to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. We are also going to share a bit about our upcoming workshop on conscious aging for those who'd like to continue to deepen the conversation we start today. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce each of our presenters one at a time for our first round of questions. So let's start with Marc Blesoff. Marc was a criminal defense attorney for over 30 years. He then moved into mediation. 6 years ago, he began facilitating the ION's conscious aging workshops. In his bio, he says, "This facilitation work has helped me melt the armor that I'd built up. It helped me to get a clue about who I'd like to be." Marc is the founding member of A Tribe Called Aging. So, excuse me. Welcome, Marc. We really look forward to hearing your perspective to the question, how is aging inherently noetic? Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Kirsten. First, I want to say thank you to IONS. Also thank you to my colleagues from A Tribe Called Aging. And thank you to all of you who are joining from all around the world to be with us here today. The pandemic that we are all experiencing, no matter where we are, has highlighted our interconnectedness. And as Kirsten mentioned, I'm reminded of Edgar Mitchell's Noetic moment, which led to his founding of IONS almost 50 years ago, traveling back from the moon in his spacecraft with a flash of insight about the interconnectedness of everything. And today's pandemic highlights Edgar Mitchell's flash of insight. Insight, an instructive word as we discuss noetic approaches to aging. And our interconnectedness highlights empathy, for after all, everybody ages, something we all have in common. If we age with intention, if we age consciously, we can embrace realistically and honestly our inevitable aging and death. Embrace it rather than fear and deny it. Now, Dominic, can I have that first slide? There we go. So why is it that older people have increased feelings of togetherness with past generations? Why is it older people have less interest in superfluous social interactions? Or why do we have enhanced feelings of universal awareness, like space, time, life, death are redefined as we age? Why do we have decreased interest in material things? Why do older people become more selective of what we choose to pursue? And why do older people find solitude more attractive? So don't get me wrong, this is not a description of all older people all the time. These are general observations made after years and years of research. So at about the same time that astronaut Edgar Mitchell was having his noetic moment of interconnectedness while hurtling through space, the Swedish gerontologist Lars Tornstam was trying to explain the observations he'd been making. After about 20 years of research, Tornstam came up with his theory of gerotranscendence, G-E-R-O transcendence. Tornstam and his colleagues, who were mostly men, observed people changing as they aged. For example, they observed a woman changing from being very concerned about being well-dressed to being not so concerned about appearances, more focused on comfort. Changing from maintaining a large social network to focusing on 2 or 3 quality relationships. Changing to being more concerned about existential questions rather than material possessions. Tornstam's contemporaries labeled this woman depressed and prescribed medications. There was something wrong with her that had to be fixed. Tornstam, however, saw something right with her, saw her as a part of the natural aging process. One reason aging is inherently noetic is because it allows us to be consistently available to receiving noetic information, to be consistently open to knowledge that bypasses the monkey mind. As we age, our inevitable changes, both wholeness and brokenness, will just happen without relying on rational processes. As we age, our rhythms change, and not only do we have the opportunity to get closer to being the person we'd like to be, we have the opportunity to become better acquainted with our intuition. We can start to know what is really important. Aging gives us the opportunity to embrace the noetic waters in which we swim. Now, all of us are not always able to take advantage of this opportunity, which I will talk about in a few minutes. Sometimes we need some nudging or some tools to encourage our awareness. That is just what the IONS online Conscious Aging Workshop can provide, which Kirsten will tell you about in a bit. So thank you, and Kirsten, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marc. I appreciate that overview. Next, we are going to hear from Evelina Everidge. Evelina has assisted others in navigating life transitions for over 40 years through community and social justice programs, as a registered nurse, as a board-certified psychiatric and mental health professional, and through a holistic consulting practice. Evelina's path led her to years in hospice work, and she describes sharing the end-of-life journey with individuals and their family and friends as a profound and humbling experience that provided valuable lessons in what really matters. Now retired, Evelina is a jazz vocalist, an age appreciation advocate, a member of a tribe called Aging, and an IONS Conscious Aging Facilitator. So welcome, Evelina. We'd love to hear your perspective on the question, how is aging inherently noetic?
Thank you so much, Kirsten, and thank you for everyone for being here. You know, intuition, like creativity, is something we often think of as a talent that only a few gifted people have, if we acknowledge it at all. Many of us will admit to having hunches. I just had a feeling. And sometimes we talk about women's intuition. But in our Western culture anyway, we pay a lot more attention to those left brain qualities having to do with reason and logic and authority. Listen, we older people have lived and experienced many things, and we know there are things that simply cannot be defined by logic or reason. We likely have had feelings of wonder and awe. Intuition, like imagination, has more to do with the right brain, where creativity is sparked. In some cultures, there's a tradition of inner knowing. It may be more accepted and accessed more readily, such as in some Latinx, African American, and indigenous communities, for example. Older people often have a more visible and respected role as well. Our friend Yeye Luisa Tish, a priestess in the Yoruba tradition, tells that when she went to Africa to be initiated, the elder that initiated her told her that you had to earn the right to be called old. Now there's an example of aging in Noetics, earned wisdom. Now, many white people in Western culture long for meaning and connection and appropriate traditions from other cultures. The truth is, we can look back many generations to our own ancestors and find a respect for inner knowing that was based on living in harmony with the earth and the natural world, as well as music and other forms of creative expression and rituals to honor age, death, and other passages. We can bring some of these things into our lives now. In my work with hospice, I saw people at the end of life have more access to this noetic place in the form of dreams and symbols and synchronicity, communicating with deceased loved ones and seemingly other dimensions. Many inventors and other creative people have said ideas came to them in dreams. Einstein said he got the theory of relativity in dreams. He also said imagination is more important than knowledge. When we are thinking of the past or of the future, we miss what's happening right now, right? We can cultivate intuition through what brings our awareness into the present moment. Time in nature, stillness, creativity takes many forms: movement, gardening, cooking. Many of us think we aren't creative, but we're creative every day. There's a Zimbabwean saying, if you can talk, you can sing. If you can walk, you can dance. And we can learn from other cultures the practice of meditation and mindfulness. In conscious aging, we like to talk about the Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, an ineffable quality that encompasses appreciation of that which is old, weathered, and broken, and seeing the beauty in it. Also qualities of melancholy, like a rainy day, rotting leaves in the autumn, the whistle of a train. Nothing is excluded. Dominic, could you bring up that screenshot for me, please? And here we have the 3 principles of wabi-sabi. Nothing lasts. As in nature, everything is alive and dying simultaneously. Appreciation of that is an acceptance of impermanence in all life and our own. Nothing is perfect. We can appreciate ourselves as we are as older people, with our seeming imperfections and frailties. Nothing is finished. We have the capacity to grow, learn, and change until the last moments of our life. Thank you, Dominic. Neuroscientists tell us attitudes are formed about gender, race, and age in the first 7 years of life and reinforced throughout our lives. Only 10% of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, attends to the present moment. The rest is default. Yes, the automatic things that keeps our bodies going that we're not aware of, but also the habituation, the tapes from our conditioning. So with intention, we can use our left brain minds and our hearts and compassion to recognize these habitual conditioned attitudes and beliefs that block wisdom and connection. This is the invitation in conscious aging. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelina. And just a reminder that you can populate the Q&A function with your questions. We'll have time in just a bit to ask our speakers your questions as well. And now we turn to Elizabeth White. Elizabeth is an author and advocate for older people, especially those who face uncertain work and financial jeopardy. She is the author of 55, Underemployed and Faking Normal, and her TEDx talk has drawn more than 1.7 million views. She's also a 3-time guest on the PBS NewsHour. Her essays have appeared in Forbes, the Huffington Post, Next Avenue, and the Washington Post, and she is a member of A Tribe Called Aging. So welcome, Elizabeth. I look forward to hearing your perspective on the question, how is aging inherently noetic?
I was inspired by Evelina's comment where she's under wabi-sabi, where she talked about nothing is perfect. And I'm thinking about how I am managing actually through this pandemic. And one of them is I now, rather than striving for what is ideal, I strive for what is acceptable. And in America, we sort of have 2 versions of what it means to be old. One of them is weak, feeble, could even mean not contributing, could be poor. It's sort of the old woman under a bridge. And then the other is what I call positive aging happy talk, where successful aging means that how many youthful attributes can you hang on to? Are you still getting ready to go out there and climb Mount Kilimanjaro? Are you still skydiving? So at 66, I didn't resonate to either one of these. I'm at a point in my life where I am pausing. My daughter is launched. I'm much more picky now about the kind of assignments that I accept. During the Great Recession, I hit a kind of financial icy patch of someone who had been very successful until I wasn't. And I, after having been a C-suite executive, having been worked at the World Bank, having been an entrepreneur, I lost 2 big consulting assignments during the Great Recession, and suddenly was facing a lot of financial difficulty. And I was in my mid-50s then, and at that point, without my experiences that I could distract myself with, my toys, I had to go inward. I had to figure out, how do I claw myself back when I was at that point looking in at a world that was no longer mine. And what the Noetic sciences for me is, it's a pathway in to the kinds of questions that we're asking in this final chapter, you know, of our lives. I have at 66 more time behind me than I have ahead of me. And we are, especially if we are boomers now, a generation where many of us we're going to live much longer than we ever have before. And we're going to live in reasonably good health. So there are a lot of questions around, what do we do with this time? You know, both Evelina and Marc have talked about that at this phase of life, the focus is not on material things. The focus is not on striving. And we don't have many roadmaps. We don't have many role models that teach us how to live in this phase of life. And the truth is, many of us are going to be living in this phase of life with much less income than we had expected. Something like 40% in the US, 40% of near retirees are going to be living in poverty or near poverty conditions. This is a conversation we don't have. So then, how do you have a richly textured life on a modest income? What is the frame for doing that? What is the kinds of tools that you can have that you can feel grounded and content if your life is going to be very different than you expected it to be? And this is what I feel like the Noetic sciences gives us. It gives us a toolkit. It gives us another way of thinking about, how do we remain grounded and content? How do we see what we have in common with others? How do we build and deepen those connections? So in that way, it is an invitation into aging that is very different than you will see kind of the images in magazines and on television, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So you've each laid the groundwork for establishing the concept that aging is inherently noetic. So now let me ask you, why is this important? You've alluded to that a bit, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper. So let's start with Evelina, please. You'll need to unmute yourself, Evelina.
Okay, so aging in general, and this time of transformation in particular, calls for us to assess what really matters. As we spend time at home, if we're fortunate to have a home and our basic needs are met, do we focus on how to fill the time, just trying to cope and distracting ourselves? Do we push uncomfortable feelings away? Or will we choose also to use this time to learn about ourselves, perhaps in surprising ways? Can we learn to choose our response to uncertainty? To paraphrase the writer and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl,
Looks like we may
threat
have
of
had
pandemic, but we do have the choice on how we respond.
Evelina, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm sorry to do that, but you froze up. We heard you saying or starting to attribute the quote. If you don't mind starting there again, that would be helpful.
Yes, absolutely. There has been some freezing on my end too. I was paraphrasing a quote by the late writer and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, in which he said, "In the face of what we cannot change or control, we are challenged to change ourselves." We can't control the invisible threat of pandemic, but we do have the choice how we respond. As older people, we've always been marginalized in an ageist society, and add to that intersectionality. Now in the pandemic, that ageism is rampant as we're viewed as more expendable. In that, we have commonality with other groups who are most impacted, essential workers, as white people with people of color who are impacted, and economically marginalized, who are the majority of essential workers.
Well, it looks like we are having more technical difficulties there. I think you're back now, Evelina.
Okay, it seems
we heard you
stable here,
we heard you end with workers.
Okay, I'm surprised the internet isn't broken, honestly, with all the use it's gotten. I was commenting on how ageism has impacted older people, as we're told we're expendable. And we have that in common to one degree or another with people who are designated as I think of people of color and people who are economically marginalized, who, by the way, comprise most essential workers. So the imbalances and inequities are showing us what needs to change, be an ongoing cause for reflection and action as we move forward. The challenge is both internal.
Apologize for the technical difficulties here. Dominic and Evelina will work together to remedy those. But why don't we move over to Elizabeth again? And Elizabeth, if aging is inherently noetic, why is that important to us?
So 3 times I have gone to the George Floyd protest. As a 66-year-old woman, I have stayed on the edges in case there was tear gas or there was some other problem. And I go to the protest, and I'm someone old enough to have lived through integration, through separation, integration, through affirmative action, through what else? Through diversity, through inclusion, and now equity. And while I'm there, I am astonished and moved by looking at the humanity around me, every shade and hue, every age, lots of young people that just a few months ago we were saying that Generation Z had were stuck to their phones, uninformed and apolitical, and here they are leading. And as an older person, I think about what is my role there. I'm not going to be at the front of the protest this time. And how can I be a good ally to these young people? Especially when, as a boomer, we are used to being in control, needing to be in control, used to leading, used to taking charge. And that's not what's being asked of us now. So what the Noetic sciences, it is a toolkit for how do we hang back? How do we calibrate our response to the invitation that younger people may offer us? How do we not have to be the one leading in charge and the boss? I was a couple of months ago, saw a documentary about Fred Hampton, Black Panther activist, and it was amazing the work that he did, his brilliance, his strategic approach, his ability to bring people together. He was murdered. He was only 21 years old. And I know that in this movement that is worldwide, there are young people already out there, brilliant like he was. And can we, as older adults, be guided by them, be open to their wisdom, their way of doing things? So what I feel like in this moment where discussion about institutional racism is now turning into action, as older people, we're figuring out what our role is. And we're having to change in some ways our accustomed way of being in the world. And what Noetic studies does is to help us with that, to think differently about what our contribution can be, to give us tools to listen to our own inner wisdom, our own intuition, to get out of the way of ego. So I think now it is particularly pertinent as this global movement is happening, and we are charged as older adults with figuring out what our role will be.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Marc, what are your thoughts on this? Why is it important that aging is inherently noetic?
Thank you for asking. Can I just ask if, would it be worth it to try and go back to Evelina just to have her finish up?
Sure, absolutely. Evelina, should we try your connection again? And
Yeah, I think I'm back. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
So far, so good. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I left off talking about how we can use our mental process in tandem with our noetic to cultivate more ability to look inward. And the more we do that, our awareness increases. Paying attention to language matters. Words that we use as older people, words like "at my age," "I'm too old for," "this is how I am, I can't change," or self-deprecating phrases like "senior moment" limit us. And denying our age, believing successful aging is staying youthful as long as possible, implies old is bad. When we use ageist language, we devalue ourselves. We can learn to reframe these things, and it reinforces the possibility for growth available in aging. Calls for self-compassion and self-care. Mindfulness can help us to respond rather than react, so that we are not as sensitive to triggers that bring up defenses, and we become better listeners and learners. This is also a time of reflection. Looking back on our lives, we may see our stories from a new perspective, as we recall times when we went through change and crises. What sustained us? What blocked us? You know, we contain every age we've ever been. What a rich well to draw from. Perhaps an inner knowing or sense guided us in what to do. We see what we learned from it, how it changed us, and built our strength and resilience, which is a very valuable commodity. The threat of COVID makes us more conscious of our mortality. We can fear it or choose to empower ourselves in the ways that we can. If we've put off having honest conversations with loved ones, now's the time. We can share our fears and anxieties, we can share our stories, our memories, and we can do end-of-life planning if we've put it off. Make living wills, designate a medical power of attorney, and make our wishes known. This can take time, thought, and checking in with ourselves. So let's ask ourselves what our legacy will be. Elizabeth talked about younger people who say they feel they've inherited problems created by our generation that we haven't tried hard enough to dismantle. Climate change, inequities, economic imbalances. We have an opportunity in these amazing times to be part of shaping a new vision of the future. We have a voice that is needed, and what we model now is important. If we are to be allies in partnership with younger generations and other communities, we must take the responsibility to go deeper. I recently read a meme that said, learn to discern the difference between your intuition guiding you, your wounds misleading you. I would add our internalized and conditioned attitudes misleading us. And listen, it's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing practice like developing any new skill. The tools, resources, and sharing provided in ION's Conscious Aging workshops, listen, have been invaluable to me, not just in aging, but in this time of change, and continue to guide me. These practices deepen empathy and help us to appreciate our commonality. What could be more important and needed now?
Wonderful. Thank you, Evelina. All right, Marc, we'd love your take. Why is this important?
Okay, Dominic, could you pull up that slide to start with? And I'll try and make up some time. So in his book, The Five Invitations, Frank Ostaseski writes, we've all had moments when we discovered solutions to our problems without needing to, quote, figure them out, unquote. We've said things like, all of a sudden, it became clear, or the answer just came to me, or there was no question in my mind what I had to do. It is a quality of mind that senses what is needed without relying solely on rational processes. Not a bad definition of noetic. We can just know things naturally, like what happens to us as we age, trusting our intuition, an opportunity to know who we are at this moment. There's a quote, sometimes attributed to Daniel Boorstin, sometimes attributed to Stephen Hawking, but it goes like this. The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. The illusion of knowledge. Last month, one of my daughters and I were standing on the edge of a lake at dusk, watching a kayak moving away from us out past a buoy. A bit later, and a bit darker outside, she pointed out the kayak heading back toward us. I said, no, that's just the buoy. Moments later, I did indeed see the kayak headed back. She reacted. She said, you immediately thought I was wrong because you couldn't see what I could see. And she was right. So why haven't we seen that aging is inherently noetic? Dr. Dean Radin, ION's chief scientist, in his book, Real Magic, a very good book, Dean Radin talks about analytical overlay. We have multiple layers of cultural conditioning that prevent us from seeing, or at least inhibit us from seeing. One such layer of cultural conditioning is ageism. Dominic, you have that slide? The picture slide, yeah. Okay, so this was an advertisement in the New York City subway system. When you want a whole cake to yourself because you're turning 30, which is basically 50, which is basically dead. Okay, Postmates is a food delivery. So somebody at Postmates figured this was funny and would attract business. They had to take this ad down. This is an example of cultural ageism. It's also internalized ageism because we are the ones laughing at ourselves out of being ashamed, but it's not even funny. Most of us consider aging as making the best of a bad situation. At A Tribe Called Aging, we see it as life more wonderful, not just less horrible. Very few of us want to get old. We prefer young. In fact, as Evelina said, we think old is bad. And that's another layer of cultural conditioning. Internalized ageism causes us older people to lock ourselves away inside, just as our society locks away our older people in nursing homes. Today, our noetic knowing supports our interconnectedness. It is in our own interest to be anti-ageist. And today, in this moment, for us older people who are white, it is in our own interest to be anti-racist. In that lake near where my daughter and I were standing, sometimes a fish will jump completely out of the water. I often wonder what it might be like for a fish to have that glimpse of another world, perhaps a flash of insight into our atmosphere world, just as it falls back into its water world. I think of Edgar Mitchell's Noetic moment. If aging is inherently noetic, it can offer us more than momentary flashes of insight. As we age, in our last third of this physical existence, the very water in which we swim could be our noetic fabric. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Marc. Oh, so much to continue to dive into. Really rich and thoughtful responses. So thank you, each of you, for approaching these really deep and broad questions. Soon we will be turning to some of the questions that our attendees have posted, and we have quite a few of them here. But before we do that, I'd love to turn it over to Evelina, who is going to lead us in an experiential moment or two. Thank you, Evelina.
Okay, thank you. I just want to add, I've been trying to dip into some of the chat comments, and I hope there's a way we can capture all of them, because I appreciate your comments and I'm open to learning from them. So thank you for that. I'd like to focus for a moment on mindfulness. We've talked about that as a method to get more in touch with our inner selves. You know, it's interesting. I heard a talk by Frank Ostaseski, who was the founder of the Zen Hospice in San Francisco and wrote a beautiful book called The 5 Invitations about what he learned from people who are dying. And he's a Buddhist practitioner, and he said, you know, often we focus on the mind and the heart, but that both the mind and the heart can be focused on the past or the future, whereas the body is always present in the now. Even though we know that we hold emotions in our bodies, but the body needs to be in the now to take care of business and keep us alive. So in our mindfulness practice, it's recommended that we tune into what's going on in our bodies. So I would like to just guide us into a short mindfulness meditation. And I invite you, if you choose, to close your eyes and take a deep breath with me. And continue to notice your breath. You might experience it as the air moving into your nostrils and then blowing out, or perhaps you feel it in your chest or your belly, the gentle rise and fall. And your thoughts may want to take hold, but just bring your attention back to that breath. And let's do a scan of the body. And when I say body, I mean today's body. Today's body may be different than yesterday's or tomorrow's. It's where your body is right now. Notice if there's any areas of tension, discomfort, stress. And perhaps you could imagine sending your breath to those areas. Many of us avoid feeling our bodies because we may have pain, chronic pain. But putting our attention there can also help to soothe that and comfort that. As you breathe and notice, perhaps you can begin to tune into what your body is asking for. Is it rest? Is it water? Is it food? Is it comfort? Is it asking you to try and release some stress? Just notice what's going on, what might be needed. And you could put your hand on an area that seems to call for attention, or perhaps just putting your hand over your heart center. And breathing in, breathe out loving kindness towards yourself. And breathe out loving kindness towards the areas of your body asking for attention. Notice as you hold your heart and focus on loving kindness, any changes that might happen. Are you letting go or relaxing? And it's okay if not, simply noticing and breathing and feeling loving kindness as you're able. And if you wish, you can breathe out loving kindness towards others, loved ones or people unlike you. And notice now what's going on around you, any sounds, sensations. Just being present right now with no judgment. And take another deep breath in and exhale. And bring your awareness now back to this moment that we're having together as we move forward.
Beautiful. Thank you, Evelina.
Thank you.
I personally always find it difficult to transition from those beautiful inward spaces. So I'll just take a second to breathe. And now we're going to move into the Q&A portion. We've been pretty active over there in our Q&A box. So thank you everybody for submitting your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. I want to start with a question that I think Marc can answer from an anonymous attendee, asking how elders within the IONS community can connect with each other if they live in a community without noetic values. And I'd love it if you would speak not only to the workshop, but to your ongoing conversations through A Tribe Called Aging.
Okay, so post in the pandemic world, it's a different world, and connecting globally is a more common and natural thing. Would you just tell me that question one more time?
Absolutely. How can elders within the IONS community connect with each other if they live in a community without noetic values?
Yeah, okay. So, of course, you'll hear about the IONS Online Conscious Aging Workshop program, which we are starting in a couple of weeks, the next go-round. There's also any number of organizations and individuals who are meeting, sharing, talking, and co-creating sacred space digitally. Kirsten referred to one thing that Tribe Called Aging has been doing for 3 going on 4 months now, which is every Wednesday having a drop-in Zoom session talking about aging in the age of pandemic and what that means in this moment of social consciousness and awareness. So what can, and you know what? You can reach out to 3 of your friends and just do it yourself. This is what's happening. It's bubbling up all over the country. It's not just the wonderful work IONS is doing, or the stuff that a tribe called Aging is doing, or Saging International, or Elders Networks, or it's bubbling up everywhere. You can do it too. And contact us, and we'll work on it. Thanks.
We will be sending out a follow-up email with a recording of this presentation, and we'll also include these resources. There are a number of questions that are asking for restatements of some of the quotes that were said during the presentation, the slides, the name of the documentary. We will include all of that in a follow-up email so you have those resources close at hand, as well as how to contact our 3 presenters today. So thank you for that, Marc. I would love to turn the next question to Elizabeth. You know, Elizabeth, you spoke of having a new toolbox or needing to revamp your toolbox and do things a little bit differently now. You're talking about standing in a different place during the protests. And so Ernst asks, and if you don't mind unmuting yourself, Elizabeth, how do we move from aging in a competitive community to aging in a stewardship community? And he follows that up with, how can we create the latter, a stewardship community, within an economically and politically competitive society?
So what happened to me as I was describing, so I'm coming, live in Washington, D.C., it's always, what do you do and who are you working with and how big a budget are you managing and all of that. And then what happened to me happened to me. And suddenly I had to get off my throne. I'm someone, I've flown business class, etc. The times after that, I was on the bus going to New York for a meeting. What I found when my book is 55 Underemployed and Faking Normal, when I stopped faking normal, then my people could find me and I could find them. And I started to have the kind of circle, the kind of support and friendship, because your tribe is there. Even in environments where you feel like you're surrounded by people who don't share your values, your tribe is there, but they have to see you. So that means that at meetings, you have to identify yourself by speaking up. You have to go where they are. You have to allow yourself to be found. And I decided I would come out. I would tell the truth about what was happening. I would be candid about, and so many people were in the Me Too. I didn't come out knowing that would be the case. We don't talk about financial fragility of older middle-class people. We talk about someone who's been struggling their whole life and they're having a rough go of it in old age. We don't talk about people who are doing fine and now they're struggling. And when I opened, you know, my coat to be truthful about that, it allowed so many people who are also experiencing what I was experiencing to come forward. And I'm thinking that could be the case with you as well.
Great, beautiful. Thank you, Elizabeth. Evelina, I would love to pose this next question to you. It actually relates a little bit to the slide Marc showed us from the subway system that needed to be removed. But I'd love to get your perspective as well. Sarah asks or says, the meme that 50 is the new 30 raises hope and expectations while devaluing the life experience gained, what we have nurtured into wisdom. She also says, thank you, each of you, for being role models as we mature age. But I would love to hear a little bit more about your perspective on that, the devaluing of the experience gained and how we can address that in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I think about this all the time, that it's not an either or proposition. It doesn't mean when we say that we don't want to identify ourselves as youthful as the criteria for successful aging. It doesn't mean that we still don't choose to pursue our passions and the activities based on our ability, but it means that we don't leave out those of us in our aging community who prefer not to be as active or have different abilities. If we put value on productivity, then we shame just being. And the just beingness is the state where noetics exist. It's a balance between the two. So we don't want to leave anything out of the process. We as aging people are not one homogeneous group. And yet we are branched into that by media, that we're seeing that now during pandemic. The elderly, as if everyone over 65 who are targeted as high risk are all the same. But we never at any point in our lives do we have so much richness and diversity as we become more truly ourselves as we age. So it's not that we shouldn't try to do things and be active and pursue our passions, but it's that we don't define ourselves as good or bad by that. The aging experience encompasses everything, and we need to be seen as in that light. So that would be my response.
Great, thank you, Evelina. The next question I'd actually pose to all three of you. So we'll go round robin. Marc, you happen to be first on my screen, so I'd love to hear from you. This is from Victoria, what has been surprising for you as you have more consciously contemplated aging?
Wow, surprising. I have been surprised by how clueless I was. And I'm thankful that I have that awareness. And the awareness gives me an opportunity to change. Doesn't guarantee the change, but it gives me that opportunity. And and one of the things in particular that always resonates for me is the importance of relationships. It's pretty much the whole ball game. And as we age, or as I age, and my rhythms shift, and I'm able to actually see a lot of what I had been missing for a lot of my life. That's what I have to say.
Thank you. Elizabeth, you are next on my monitor. Would you care to share what has been surprising to you as you have more consciously contemplated aging?
I would say sort of what it means to be 66, sort of what I thought this would mean when I was 30, when I was 35. And I think in my mind, you sort of just fell off a cliff. And I am, so when I look at the pandemic, I see the horror of it. I see the heartbreak of it. I see the uncertainty of it. I also realized that during the lockdown, that there was something peaceful for me in it. There was, it made very clear what was important. I exist in about 4 t-shirts and a few pair of black yoga pants. And there has and I'm someone who likes clothes as adornment. And just this crystal clear insight that has shifted me even from this time this year to this time last year.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. And Evelina, sorry, I lost the question. Let me repeat it for you. One moment, please.
Is anything surprising? Was that it?
Yes, as you contemplate aging. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I am what's called a solo ager. I don't have a partner or children or living family. So I'm living on my own in low-income senior housing. And I had a lot of fears about what my life would be like. I'm 73 now. What would happen to me if I became ill, or how would I survive on my Social Security income, or would I be able to find affordable housing? And I find myself waking up with gratitude every day that my spiritual family has stepped forth. And I don't feel isolated and alone, even though I've been very stay at home for the past 4.5 months because there are so many people with high risk illnesses in my building. I've been very mindful about going out as little as possible. And sometimes I feel touch deprived, but I have that sense of connection that people care about me. And it's really helped me to transform fears I have about the future. I really have this deep trust that I'll be taken care of and things will be okay no matter what happens. And when I speak to, there are people in my building, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and some of them, differently abled in wheelchairs. And we have conversations, and more often than not, people will say, this is the best time of my life. This is the culmination. I feel more at peace with myself, or more comfortable in my own skin. And I would have to say, I feel that way as well. And that's been surprising.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. There's so many good questions. I'm just working my way through them and hoping we can get to as many as possible. Here's a follow-up for Elizabeth. Carmen asks, how do you define successful? As in your statement, I was successful until I wasn't.
So it would be that I had what I would call the props and credentials that we in this country, sort of the union ticket that you would punch. So I went to Harvard, and I went to Johns Hopkins, and I was a C-suite executive, and I, was an entrepreneur, and I had all of the stuff, and I, worked at the World Bank and was traveling around the world, and kind of all of that. And I grew up as an Army brat, Black girl, then Black woman, and that my parents hoped for me to be successful in very traditional terms. And I was. buy those sort of tickets that you punch in America. I think a profound thing for me was when I became an entrepreneur, and I had a chain of Afrocentric lifestyle stores in 3 states. And I started to work with a number of small entrepreneurs who could care less about what school I went to. And there was a shift in that, because there was also a cultural orientation that the people I was buying my products from. And so that was the start of, it didn't matter to them, those kinds of things. Other things matter. But traditionally, to answer the question of the person who asked it, and I define success in very traditional ways.
Beautiful. Thank you. Marc, I'm wondering if you would like to hold this question from Renata. How is being an elder and eldership different from conscious aging? Or is there a difference?
Well, I think anyone can age consciously. Doesn't matter how old you are or what the number is. Then one thing we learn as we continue to age is really the numbers don't matter. It's just who we are. I think, as Evelina said, we're all the ages we've ever been, which is very rich. So the difference between conscious aging and an elder, elders, maybe there's not much of a difference, because I think elderhood and elders, there's an aspect of awareness in there. Everybody gets older, but I'm glad I'm not as clueless as I used to be about this. Okay, so, but I didn't have to be that way. I could have just plowed on through and been older, an older person, and not have much elderhood. So I think conscious aging can assist us to become elders.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before we go into our wrap-up comments. And Evelina, I'd love for you to speak to this one. Susan asks, please talk about life for the oldest of the old, those over 90. And you'll have to unmute yourself, Evelina.
Well, of course, not being that age myself, I can't really speak to that experience. And I think there is not any one universal experience of being in your 90s. We see great diversity within 90-year-olds. So, but I think that we do have different developmental tasks, challenges, and opportunities at different decades of our older life. And that as we move closer to the end of our life, we become more contemplative about what has brought us purpose and meaning, and how do we prepare to accept death. We're in a very death-denying culture. And that's why in conscious aging, we talk about death makes life more precious, not denying death. And that death denial is what our culture, at least in the West, is based on. So I think when we reach our 90s, we are thinking more about how much more time do we have left? How can we make sure that that time is quality? And how can we make peace with our inevitable death? That would be my thoughts on what I anticipate I'll be thinking about in my 90s.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Evelina. Well, thank you all. And thanks to everybody who's joined us for these deep questions. I hope we can get to more of them as the conversation continues in various manners. We have just about a minute for each of you to give us some wrap-up thoughts, how you'd like to close out today. We'll share a little bit more after that about how you can look at registering for conscious aging if you're interested. But let's start with some final thoughts for the moment from Marc.
Okay. I guess what I'd like to just close with is a quote from a book called The Sage's Tao Te Ching. This is a book that we use in the online IONS Conscious Aging workshops. It's written by a Taoist scholar named William Martin. There is loss in growing older, but if you can manage not to cling, your hands will remain open, ready to receive new gifts of contentment, wisdom, and depth of soul. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc. And Elizabeth, we turn to you.
There's a lot of self-selection if you're on this call. There's something about it when you read what was going to be offered here that spoke to you in a deeper way. This would not resonate with everybody. And it did resonate with you, and that's why you are here and why you stayed the whole time. The workshop that we're offering is an invitation for you to go deeper with this. And I'd love to have you join us. And it would be, I think, particularly rich having people from different backgrounds, different cultures, so that we can go the next step in the conversation that we have started here. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Evelina.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's hardest about being older is if one feels isolated. I think connection and support is so important. In our workshops, one of the features of it is breaking out into small group discussions. And people say that's the richest part of it for them. Realizing that we're not alone in the way that we feel and our commonality. That can have ripples like a stone in a pond. It's so important that we come together, support each other, grow and learn together. Isolation is insidious. So there are many ways to do that now, thanks to the internet, and that more of us are learning how to use the technology than ever before. So if you're not able or interested in this series of the Conscious Aging workshops, please find a way to continue the conversation in your communities online. You know, that support is available. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you, IONS, Kirsten, my amazing colleagues, Elizabeth and Marc.
Thank you, Evelina. Dominic, if you don't mind putting up that slide, we'll just share a little bit of information about the upcoming Conscious Aging Workshop. It begins on Thursday, July 23rd at 11 a.m. Pacific time. There are 6 sessions, and this call was done in a webinar format, but for the Conscious Aging online workshop, we work in a meeting format, so we can all see each other, we all have access to our microphones, our webcams, and so on. And so the conversation is very rich and very deep. And if you feel called, we invite you to sign up for that. We have a 3-tiered pricing system, so you can find the approach that works best for you. So thank you, dear panelists, Marc, Evelina, and Elizabeth, for your time, for your wisdom, for your wonderful hearts. We so appreciate being able to experience this with you. And thank you to everyone who joined us. I hope our paths will cross again soon in any way that may happen for us. Wishing you all well. Take care. Bye-bye.